1939. Germany attacked Poland and the world found itself heading towards war. The conflict would be brutal. Millions would die. In 1919, so much thought and effort had gone into making sure the horrors of the First World War would never be repeated. Yet barely a generation later, it was happening again. Why did the Second World War break out only 20 years after the end of the First? We're going to look at 6 key, smaller questions which will help you investigate this. Did the peacemakers at the end of the First World War make a mess of their task? Why were the German people so unwilling to give their support to the Weimar Republic? How did Hitler and the Nazis come to power? Whose fault was it that the League of Nations failed to keep the peace in the 1930s? Was Hitler always planning to go to war? Was appeasement a cowardly policy? Paris, spring 1919. Europe had just lived through the devastation of the First World War, and the French people welcomed the men who'd helped them win victory. At the peace conference at Versailles, just outside Paris, the most powerful of the victorious nations were represented by Woodrow Wilson, President of the USA, Clemenceau, President of France, and Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain. Their next challenge was to prevent a war like that happening again, but they would have to move fast. Parts of France and Belgium had been devastated by 4 years of war. Much of Europe was in chaos. Starvation, homelessness and disease were widespread, and across the continent there was upheaval. Austria-Hungary, Germany and Russia had all lost their emperors in popular uprisings. Many people were terrified that the communist revolution which had rocked Russia would spread throughout Europe. At Versailles in 1919, each of the peacemakers had his own wish list for the conference. The French President Clemenceau wanted the Germans to be punished, and he wanted to stop any future aggression. In 1870, Germany had taken Alsace-Lorraine. In 1919, Clemenceau demanded it back. He wanted Germany's army reduced and its borders with France cleared of any military force. France had borrowed heavily from the USA to fund its war effort. To pay back that money and to compensate them for the country's destruction, Clemenceau demanded reparations from Germany. He was determined to weaken the German economy. The US President Woodrow Wilson was an idealistic man with big ideas for achieving world peace. Wilson didn't believe that the ordinary people of Europe wanted war. He believed that emperors were the warmongers. Central to his 14 points proposals, which had been published before the end of the war, was the idea that European nations should be governed democratically. That way, the leaders would have to listen to the peaceful wishes of their people. The old empires contained many different ethnic groups. Wilson proposed that those people should govern themselves. Self-determination, he called it, though his understanding of the complex ethnic groupings in Europe was limited. Wilson's other bugbear was secret diplomacy. He believed this encouraged the conspiracies and misunderstandings that lead to war. His idea for a League of Nations was to try and solve disputes between countries fairly and openly. The US president didn't want to punish Germany too harshly, in case it might look for revenge and start another war. Britain's Prime Minister Lloyd George had his own agenda too. Britain had lost 1 million soldiers in the First World War, and the British people needed someone to blame for starting it. And like France, Britain had borrowed heavily to finance its war and wanted Germany to pay. Lloyd George had just won the general election in November 1918 by appealing to these feelings. Privately, he favoured more lenient treatment for Germany. Before the war, it had been Britain's second biggest trading partner. It was in Britain's interest for Germany to get back on a good economic footing as soon as possible and start trading again. Germany's large navy was another matter. It might still threaten the British Empire. So did the German colonies. Britain wanted its navy cut down to size and the colonies taken out of German control. In the end, each of the peacemakers had to give way on some of their demands. The compromise they eventually agreed became the Treaty of Versailles. Germany did lose a significant amount of territory. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, and France would occupy the Saar for 15 years, as a guarantee that reparations would be paid. After that, a referendum of the Saarlanders would decide if they wanted to be French or German. The Rhineland was demilitarized to give France additional protection along its border with Germany. 8 new countries were created from the Eastern European empires: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Each was to have a democratic government. Poland and Czechoslovakia also ended up with German-speaking minorities. Germany's army and navy were drastically reduced. It would be allowed no submarines and no air force. Germany had to accept sole blame for starting the war, and following this had to pay £6,600 million to the Allies in reparations. And Germany lost all its colonies. Lastly, the peacemakers set up the League of Nations.
To promote international cooperation and achieve international peace by the firm establishment of international law.
So, was there any reason to suppose the treaty would fail? The treaty went down badly with the German people, who felt humiliated. Germans had taken pride in their powerful army. Now they felt robbed of their sense of greatness. This German cartoon from the 1920s complains how unfair it was that only Germany had been forced to disarm. At the end of the war, the Germans had expected to be able to negotiate the peace. Instead, they were forced to sign the treaty, as if they'd surrendered. Many Germans did not accept that they alone had caused the war. Even so, Germany was made to pay enormous reparations, which weakened the German economy and would have serious consequences for the Weimar Republic in the early 1920s. Redrawing the map meant many Germans found themselves living in Poland and Czechoslovakia, being ruled, as they saw it, by foreigners. It created thousands of refugees. This contradicted Wilson's 14 points. Many Germans felt they were being denied the self-determination Wilson was offering other nationalities. German anger and resentment, not enough to cause a war on its own perhaps, but not a good recipe for a lasting peace. Fritz Thyssen made his fortune in his steelworks in the Ruhr. In his retirement in the south of France, he wrote about how he thought the German people had reacted.
The signature of a humiliating treaty condemned a whole nation to a sort of economic slavery, rendered insulting by a confession of guilt, and gave rise to the violent nationalistic reaction, which soon gathered momentum throughout Germany.
And even though Britain, France and the USA had put together the Treaty of Versailles, neither they nor their voters were satisfied with the outcome.
There is a growing feeling in the Senate that the whole treaty should be thrown out of the window.
US politicians listened to this kind of speech, and the Senate refused to ratify the treaty. As for the French, Clemenceau himself felt the treaty was too lenient. The French voters seemed to agree, and Clemenceau was voted out of office in 1920. One member of the British delegation at Versailles later wrote,
"We arrived, determined that a peace of justice and wisdom should be made. We left, knowing that the treaties were neither just nor wise."
This cartoon appeared in Britain in 1919. The peacemakers are passing a pillar at Versailles. Behind it is a child who'll be of an age to fight in 1940. The child is crying. Even in 1919, therefore, there were people who believed the peace would only last a generation.